Hello world of YouTube and welcome to my February listening log update for 2018. This one is dropping a little later than the last one did, and I do apologize for that. Things got a little hectic the last weekend of February, and also this isn't the only thing I plan on doing in the channel now. I've just had a really busy beginning of the year. I do plan on doing other music discussion based content, but before I get into the 9 albums, that's how you do 9, that we're going to talk about this month, there's a couple of things that I want to address. The first being, I got mixy bag. That's actually weird. And the last bit of news that I want to talk about is an EP that I'm not working on, but I had a hand in, behind the scenes wise. Podcast buddy and former music reviewer Mark Berman of the Mad Sounds podcast is putting out his next EP under his Fully Involved moniker. It's coming out April 13th, and I think you guys should check it out. Again, I had a hand in the behind the scenes. It sounds really good. I'm really hyped for it, and I'm excited to see people's reactions to it. It's called Insolence, and it's a really heartfelt project. With that out of the way, let's get into these 9 albums. So this is actually an album I was listening to at the end of January that kind of bled into February, and I wanted to hold off my opinions about until I kind of gave it a few more listens. And that's the latest Orphaned album, Unsung Prophets and Dead Messiahs. And for those who don't know who Orphaned are, I talked about them in my top 11 albums of all time video because I really fucking love their album Mabul. I like their content pre and post Mabul. I do think they've had a bit of a rough period post Mabul. They've swapped out members, they've lost members, and they've had a hard time really finding their footing as a band. I do think they kind of picked up their momentum a little better on their previous effort, All Is One. It dropped a lot of those heavier tendencies, but I don't think they were at a loss for it. However, I do enjoy that they are brought back in a better presence on this album. I think Warrior Wave, their album after Mabul, is a little sloppy. They had a harder time balancing those folk and metal tendencies, but on this, they balance it a lot better, and I think that's partially due in the fact that this album had a lot of guests. There's a lot of people's hands in the pot, and while that kind of failed for the Foo Fighters on their latest project, I think that it works well for these guys. It brings this sort of unity in the metal community for a band that has a really important message to say. I think it's a great record. I think the band is in a better form here than they have been, as far as the metal aspect is, in a long time, because All Is One isn't as much a traditional metal record as it's kind of just a folk, aggressive project. And I'm not counting the joint album they did with the Massacre, because that album wasn't really an album, it was kind of an extended EP, and I have issues with that. But nevertheless, I think having a lot of hands on the pot this time benefited this band well. I think it's a great project. I think it's tight, it's well done, and they strike that balance once again in a better fashion, and I give this thing like an 8 out of 10. It's a good album. Let's keep going. This album fucking sucks. It's pretty fucking rough. I didn't like the first couple of tracks that dropped, Filthy, especially. Filthy has grown on me a smidge, but not a huge smidge. It's an album that still, or it's a song that still bothers me, but I do think that there are worse things that this album does. I don't think Filthy is a good first single for it. Kind of gives the wrong impression of the album, because the album does tread more of the whole mixing country with modern production tropes, and I don't think it works. There's a huge clash between the two, especially on tracks like the title track. The title track sounds like some hokey, like, Kid Rock levels of cringe. I think some of the songs aren't as bad, but they're more just kind of bland. Like the song Morning Light with Alicia Keys isn't horrible, but it's more just kind of bland. It sounds like a song that would be in, like, a coffee ad. It's pretty bad. There are some moments of genuine southern rootsy with a pop twist on here, especially in the tail end. Like Montana is kind of a track like that, but I still just am not a big fan of that. So ultimately, the parts that work better don't appeal to me, and the parts that don't work really don't work. I feel like if he just went straight Jolene on this, it would have benefited him a lot better, but instead, he wanted to try and be trendy, and it didn't work out. And that's not to say I hate Justin Timberlake. I've never talked about him on the channel. I like the 2020 experience. I like his, like, debut, early solo work. And I'll say I have a soft spot in my heart for NSYNC as well. So it's not like I hate his work. I do think he's just been on this progressive downfall because I didn't really like the 2020 experience too as much as the first half either. I gave it like a 3 out of 10 because I'll give it the fact that there may not be things that I work for me, but they do, or I like, but they do work musically better than others on the album, which makes it even more inconsistent. It's just, this is a mess. This album is flat out just a mess. So this next album actually has an interesting story behind it as far as like me finding the album itself. So this album, which has no name, it's technically labeled brackets as I did in the intro scene. It has a name, but it doesn't register in computers, and the band's name is just these dots. So finding this album is difficult. In fact, the only way I could listen to this album was from an upload onto a YouTube video that was comprised of the whole album in one video with live segments of each song thrown in there with the studio quality. It's not live performances, it's studio quality. It was an interesting experience finding this album. The only reason why I checked this out is because it was sitting on the Rate Your Music charts and it looked like an interesting beast. It was this album with no name, and the band's name was this, and the genre titles were J-pop, shoegaze, and noise rock, and that sounds fascinating to me, but ultimately the story of this album is a lot more interesting than the music itself. While the idea of J-pop, noise rock, and shoegaze I feel like could work, and there are bands that I feel like could do it well, this ultimately sounds like really noisy codings over very generic J-pop. And it sounds really cool at first. The first couple of tracks, the first real half of the album is interesting, and it's kind of cool to sit and listen to, but by about the halfway to tail end of the record, you can kind of see this kind of recurring theme of, alright, so they're just kind of burying these J-pop beats and vocal lines with mounds of guitar without doing anything with them. It feels very lazily put together, and that's kind of upsetting because I do think I've heard really interesting Japanese music that melds things together. One of my favorite albums is a jazz punk album by this Japanese band named Midori. Like, I've seen really cool things come out of Japanese fusions of different genres of music, and I was hoping this would be one of those, and unfortunately it really wasn't. I do again like these ideas, and I feel like they work in some instances together, but overall this thing is very underwhelming. It's very bland and kind of upsetting as a result. But with the things I do like coming together, I do think this thing is warrant at least half of an investment. I do think this thing is maybe a 6 out of 10, only because it was an interesting find, but I did hope I would like this thing more than I ended up doing. This is an album I've actually been kind of excited for. MGMT's first track to drop last year, the title track for this, genuinely surprised me. I didn't think that MGMT had it in them to continue making good music or to continue striking or making a comeback album of any sorts, but they've done it. Little Dark Age is an encapsulating, tight indie pop album that does draw a lot of influence from the 80s, like a lot of indie pop bands from the 2000s do, but they do it in a really cool way. I really like that they tap into this gothic atmosphere on some songs, and some of these songs just kind of feel like this funky, coded, not energetic track, but like the opener on this thing has a really nice funky bass line. Everything that is here, I feel like it works for a reason more often than not. I do like a majority of these songs. I think there are some really sincere moments on here. Like, on thing is incredibly catchy, it's very engaging, and the atmosphere on this thing is just entertaining. It's a great, enthralling experience that I've found myself coming back to quite often. I do enjoy this thing quite a bit. I give this thing like an 8 out of 10. It's a solid piece of music. It's a really good piece of music from these guys. Great comeback. Great comeback, guys. speaking of bands from the 2000s that I'm kind of surprised are still making music, the new Franz Ferdinand album's pretty solid. I don't like this as much as Little Dark Age, but I like it about as much as I like every other Franz Ferdinand album. And that's one thing I can tell them. If they're not bad, they're at least wicked consistent. I didn't check out the album that came out before this. It was on my to get to list, but it's just something I never got around to. But there was a point where I thought I might be seeing these guys live, and while that isn't coming together, I'm not upset that I invested my time in this thing. This album strikes a good balance between really funky, dance-driven atmospheres and some genuinely sharp songwriting. Some of the more softer moments on here do a good job at providing a lot of really good lyrical ideas or really good lyrical dynamics that I didn't think this band still had in them. I don't know why. I don't know why I think that I wasn't going to like this thing. I wasn't trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I didn't need to. These guys just genuinely encapsulated my time. The opener on this thing does a really good job of setting the stage that the band carries through until its first software moment on the Academy Award. This thing is a tight package, it's a well-paced package, and it's a well-written package. I think, if anything, I'm just surprised, and I'm glad that I enjoy this thing as much as I do. We give it like a 7 out of 10, and that statement is not meant to be condescending in any way, because if they're not going to go up, it's better to plateau, in my opinion. It's better to stay consistent than to fall off the deep end like some of the artists in this video have. One of the things I like to do, and I've done on this month especially, is check out some new rappers. You know me, I'm a fucking rap snob. And I'm always excited when I find new rap artists that at least intrigue me a little bit. And JPEG Mafia has become one of those guys. Veteran is my first project of his, but I really like his very bleak lyrical soundscape. I like a lot of his beats that he spits on. I like how raw he is. I mean, he's not obviously the rawest guy out there. There's plenty of more abstract dudes, but I like the balance he strikes between these really aggressive tones and these bleak lyrical topics with sometimes a touch of self-awareness that makes it almost funny at times. So I don't feel like he's on anybody's side, but he clearly has an agenda that he's spinning for. It's interesting to have a voice like this in this genre of hip-hop because it's usually on the other end of the spectrum. Industrial rappers outside of like David Diggs don't go to this levels of referential stuff, and again, his kind of agenda feels a little less left of center than most in the genre. This fucking review's a mess. That's why I'm doing all these post shots. I like how blunt this guy is. It's not meant to be satirical, but it almost comes across that way given how he writes and how he raps. This thing's a 7 out of 10. It's a good record, and it's like if Nihilistic Arby's were a bandcamp rapper. This is my first foray into Cupcake's music, and I mean, I had a really good time. I genuinely enjoyed this thing. She raps with about the same subtlety as a Snapchat porn star, but that's okay. I think it's really bold, and I think it's really commendable that there's someone in hip-hop that wants to rap with this sort of, again, raw, tenacious vigor. You know, when she's not being super lyrical, she's usually being very entertaining and incredibly graphic, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's nice to have someone who doesn't give a shit, who just puts herself out there, and that's respectable. I respect the fuck out of Cupcake, and I've been genuinely entranced with her music ever since I checked out FRIs. I think I was expecting a little more rawness, but when Duck Duck Goose happened, I knew what I was in for at that point. I mean, Spoiled Milk Titties, another really good song. Cinnamon Toast Crunch, tracks like that are incredibly hilarious. They're well written. She has bars on bars for days, but she also does a really good job at speaking inward and at speaking about the world in a very honest way, and I'm glad that she strikes this balance and she works this balance incredibly well. I do think she's a talented rapper. My biggest qualm with this are the instrumentals. I think the instrumentals sometimes clash with the lyrical topic she's talking about, or they sound a little milquetoast. I'd be interested to hear her spit on something a little more akin to her style, or at least her lyrical topics. I think sometimes they work. I think on tracks like the instrumentals to the funny tracks, I feel like fit because they're very hilarious, and the instrumentals just kind of enhance that hilarity to me. But I do think she's got genuine skill, you know, and I like that there's a woman who's willing to break any boundary, every boundary she can in this way, and do it with such skill and self-awareness. Again, I give this thing like a 7 out of 10. I think it's really good, and I hope to see more from Cupcake. Shout-outs to you one time. So my next album is my album of the month, Turnstile's Time and Space. I know it's not the last album I'm talking about, but I can't put this thing down. I liked Nonstop Feeling, their previous album that came out in 2015, but I like this thing even more because I think it's cool that they are keeping this very 90s hardcore sound going, but I like the little vignettes that they take on the album as well. Tracks like Bomb and I think Disco, I like that they have these little non-heavy ideas that kind of remind me of some of the vignettes Bad Brains would go on their debut, or I like that they're not just all aggro. They take the time to do something else. You know, again, it kind of reminds me of like an early 90s band. I mean, these guys invoke a lot of that if Jane's Addiction were angrier idea in my brain. They're not as consistent as those guys, but I think these guys have the potential to be. I see that in these guys, and I like that they're so raw with some of their heavy shit, like Big Smile, I Don't Want to Be Blind, fucking Come Back for More was one of my favorite tracks of last year, and I'm so glad that it's on this album because that shit gets me hype every time I throw it on. I hope for more for these guys, and I hope that they continue to grow and expand their sound and toy with more ideas as the years go on. I hope they get the chance to do that, because I think these guys have the potential to be something even better than they are now. And I accidentally rated this thing a 9 out of 10, but I've been happy leaving it there. It's been a good time. I keep enjoying it. Maybe that'll change as the year goes on, but right now, it's sitting at a spicy 9, and it is definitely, even considering that, even if it goes down in rating, the best album I've heard in February of 2018. And the last full album I heard in this month was Car Seat Headrest's Twin Fantasy. And I hadn't listened to the original recordings. I don't have any context to that, but I do think this is still a well-put-together album. I like Teens of Denial. I didn't like it as much as everybody else. I think it was a good album. I think it was really sharp. It was well-written. It reminded me a lot like Neutral Milk Hotel and They Might Be Giants stuff, which is cool. And this also kind of reminds me of that. It's very earnest. It's very sincere. It comes from a very heartfelt place, and I enjoy that. And I like that there's a voice in alternative music that is providing that style for the youth to be inspired by. I think the subject matter he's writing about on this thing is very interesting. This whole kind of love story that falls apart and the perspective that he's giving on it is really cool. And I like that this kind of representation is happening in music. Especially one that's written, again, so just sharply. I like that this guy pulls from these type of influences that aren't utilized enough in modern indie music. I mean, songs like Sober to Death, Nervous Young Inhumans, and Beach Life and Death are some of the best songs I've heard Will Toledo write so far. And I mean, I haven't heard any of his other music other than this and Teens of Denial, but I do think that this is a tighter package, and to me, a better package as a result, because one of my bigger complaints about Teens of Denial was that it was a little overwrought. It was a little drawn out in some instances, but this is a nice, tight package of a love story that is well told from beginning to end. And I hope that his next project is something new. It's something, he evolves his songwriting even more, because I think, again, like Turnstile, he has the ability to continue to be such a very integral and outspoken piece in independent music and alternative music. And I give this thing like an 8 out of 10. It's a really good album. It's my second favorite album of this month. It's a fantastic piece of indie culture that I hope others also enjoy, which they seem to, because it's fucking car seat headrest. Now that Smash Mouth's covered him, the whole fucking world is over. And that was it. As a listening log for this month. If you'd like to suggest an album for future coverage, feel free to do so in the comments below or on my social media. I currently have one on the docket. I've rearranged the listening log so that what I've listened to is first, requests are second, and then everything else I'd like to get to is after that. But either way, I'm going to get out of here. I've been Viralrak. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.